J.R. Blair is joining us tonight. And the last time he spoke to our club, we had two special guests from New Hampshire. Tonight, we only have one. Dulcie, a longtime member, welcome. She flew in this morning just for this. No pressure, J.R. J.R. joins us tonight to present Habitats, Life Cycles, and Ecology of Mushrooms. J.R. has an extensive academic background, having taught at San Francisco State for many years, I think 21. He was also the director of its Sierra Nevada field station. He has also dedicated a great deal of time and effort to this club. He's two-term past president, as the chair of the Fungus Fair committee many times, by creating an amazing mushroom display for the fair. Another volunteer, Ginny Garrett, does the woodland display, which is also amazing. This year, he has returned as a member of the Fungus Fair Planning Committee, bringing all that experience to the process. Please welcome J.R. Blair.
Okay, hello everybody. Oh. All right, so let's get right into it here. So let me see if I can figure out how to have my lovely assistant here. That's a screen share. There we go. There you go. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brennan. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Boy, there's for those of you at home, there's a big crowd here. Somebody should have warned them that I was speaking tonight, but I appreciate you all being here, our first meeting of the year. And what I want to do tonight is just to give you an overview of how fungi fit into our environment and into our lives and into this planet. So without further ado, we're going to start off with the question, what is a mushroom anyway? So in the business, we use the term fruiting body to talk about mushrooms. And it's basically the reproductive structure of the fungus. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in a minute. Now, most people, they use the term mushroom to describe a type of fruiting body. It'd be something like you see here, has a stem, has a cap. But there are lots of other types of fruiting bodies. So here's a coral mushroom here. Here's a puffballs, jelly fungus. This is a shelf fungus here. And so a lot of times, you know, depending upon your definition of mushroom, that doesn't really work. Now, not all fungi, by the way, form fruiting bodies. So those that do not form fruiting bodies are referred to typically as microfungi. And they include the majority of the group of fungi called ascomycetes. Oh, by the way, if you see a word in red, that's going to be on the exam. Just to warn you. So those that do form fruiting bodies, what do you think they're called? Macrofungi. Okay, so I might be using either of those words. Here's some couple of macrofungi I found in Thailand. Yeah, really macro. But the macrofungi, the ones that do produce fruiting bodies include most of the basidiomycetes and a few ascomycetes. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what those two categories are, but you may have heard of them before. They are the two most commonly understood or commonly encountered of the fungi in the environment. There are 4 or 5 more types besides ascomycetes and basidiomycetes, but those are all microscopic and what we refer to as microfungi. So fruiting bodies' job is to produce and disperse spores. So spore is defined as a single cell that is capable of cell division. And you need a microscope to see these little critters. These are a couple of pigmented spores. This would be brown or maybe black in mass in a spore print. And this is on average about 10 microns or so. And a micron is a micrometer, or 1,000th of a meter. Now, these spores then, once they're dispersed, if the conditions are right, and we're talking about having the right amount of moisture, the right type of chemicals in a substrate, for example, they undergo mitosis, cell division, and they start to create these chains of cylindrical cells that are called hyphae. And these are also microscopic. Turns out that all multicellular fungi and many other organisms are comprised of hyphae. By the way, what do we call unicellular fungi? Here's a little test for you. Yeast, that's right, yeast. So yeast don't have hyphae because they're unicellular, but almost all other fungi do. And there's a few other things like water molds and some slime molds that also have these cylindrical cells. I got invited to a hyphae party one time. Yeah, I didn't go. I guess I'm not that much of a fun guy. Yeah, you got it wrapped up. Yeah, I heard there was a mushroom there anyway. Yeah, you're welcome to use those jokes if you'd like. Okay. So the hyphae then grow and branch into a mass of tissue called mycelium. You probably heard that term before. So the mycelium is the part of the fungus that's interacting with the substrate. It's eating the materials that are in the soil or the wood or whatever it's in, and obtaining food and growing. So this is the business end of the fungus, if you will. And here's a photograph of some mycelium. You've all seen it. You go out in the woods, turn over a log, you see a lot of this material. And then if mycelia from two different compatible individuals fuse, that's mushroom sex. Yeah, now I want to emphasize the word compatible because that's important. That actually is pretty standard with all organisms. Now with animals like you and I, and with plants, there are just two sexes, right? Male and female. And those are compatible sexes. Now in fungi, there can be many, many different compatible types of genetically different fungi. In some examples, I've heard of over 100 different sexes, basically. So if you think about that, that really increases your chances of mushroom sex, if you will. Now, at a certain point in this life cycle, the fungus then produces the fruiting bodies that I mentioned earlier. And the way that works is that the fungus channels nutrients into these dense masses of tissue of hyphal cells that are called primordia, sometimes referred to as pinheads. In this photograph that I filched off the internet here. This is a kit, mushroom kit. Many of you have done these before. The substrate is straw, so you can see the yellow bits of straw throughout this thing. All of that white is mycelium. People who do cultivation refer to it as spawn, same thing. And then you, depending upon the type of mushroom, and these are oyster mushrooms, which are very easy to grow. But depending on the type of mushroom, you may treat it by soaking it for a while. You might put it in a dark cabinet or something like that for a couple of weeks, and then the mycelium grows. Take it out, expose it to the light, and it forms these pinheads. So again, it depends on the mushroom, but there's different conditions that result in that. You can see some larger mushrooms back in the back here that have begun to fill with water, essentially. So these pinheads, for the most part, have most, if not all of the cells are in the pinheads, ready to go and ready to be filled with water. And that's why mushrooms are associated with rainy season, for example, and why you might soak a kit ahead of time. Yes, question?
Wondering, can you know why the mycelium needs sunlight for food body?
You know, I don't know enough about it. So the question was, for those of you who are on Zoom and in the back, do scientists know why sunlight might trigger fruiting? And I don't know the answer to that. And it doesn't work all the time. You know, it seems to work with oysters and some of the other kits that you buy, but you also a lot of times open up the kit, you know, so it's wrapped in plastic, and you open it up and expose it to oxygen, presumably, and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. You know, and again, depends upon the species, what's going on. So the fruiting bodies produce these spores on fertile surfaces. And so some examples of fertile surfaces include gills. So here's a mushroom that has gills. Here's one that has tubes. So this is a bolete of some sort that I've cut in cross section, and you can see that what we see as pores on the underside of boletes and polypores are actually the ends of tubes. Here's a toothed fungus over here. This is called the cat's tongue. Whoop. Sorry. And then this is a cool mushroom here. This is, sorry. This is called Podaxis. It's a desert mushroom that is actually like a coprinoid, like a coprinus, but it grows in the desert. And anyway, those are the surfaces where the spores are produced. Sometimes they're on the exterior, like you would see with a jelly fungus or a coral fungus or a cup fungus, things like that. Okay, if you need to take a nap, this is a good time. I'm going to go through this life cycle real quickly. Quickly is a relative term, right? So we'll start here. If I can find my cursor, there it is. I'm going to start here with these two little things right here, a red spot, a blue spot. Those are spores. The spots, the colored spots, represent nuclei. And in this case, this is these are haploid nuclei, which means that there's just one set of chromosomes in each of those. And by the way, if you look under a microscope, the nuclei are not red and blue. This is just to help to differentiate them. So here they are germinating, forming the cylindrical cells, the hyphae. And also the colors represent two compatible sexes. And if they meet up together, they undergo what's called cytoplasmic fusion. And so this is where the cells fuse together. And then, and by the way, when they're in the single nucleus stage, that's referred to as primary mycelium. Once they undergo cytoplasmic fusion, that's referred to as secondary mycelium. And note that, sorry, doing the cursor and the moving the slides is the same thing, same action. Anyway, notice that there's a red spot and a blue spot in every single cell there. So what that means is that the cytoplasm fuses, but the nuclei don't fuse yet. That happens later. With animals such as ourselves, when you have an ovum and a sperm cell, cytoplasmic so by the way, it's like if you think of the scales like a Death Star and an X-Fighter, when the cytoplasmic fusion happens, the nucleus from the sperm cell gets dumped into the ovum, and then nuclear fusion happens almost immediately thereafter. But it doesn't happen. That doesn't happen with the basidiomycete fungi. So this mycelium, the secondary mycelium, can hang out as long as, decades, actually. It could hang out for long, long periods of time. With some fungi, it lives as long as the food source does, which might be a pine needle or something like that. And it might be just a season that it hangs out. So the secondary mycelium can be, again, can be in the substrate for a long period of time or a short period of time, depending upon the species. At some point, though, in most cases, and again, not always, the fungus then produces the primordium, the pinhead, and then a fruiting body like this. On the fertile surface, in this case, gills, out at the ends of that fertile surface, you'll see these little terminal cells. Again, note that the nuclei have not fused yet. But in those terminal cells on the gills, when everything's right, the conditions are right, the mushrooms matured, then nuclear fusion happens, and then we end up in the diploid stage. Diploid meaning two sets of chromosomes in each nucleus. And you can see that here with a blue and a red dot. And here's again where this life cycle really differs a lot from animal life cycles and from plant life cycles. That cell that now is diploid undergoes meiosis almost immediately. So the diploid stage is fleeting, and it only occurs at the cellular level on the fertile surface. And meiosis is the replication reduction of the cell, right? So to review your biology, and by the way, don't wake up yet if you're taking your nap, because we're still in this. That diploid cell undergoes a division event, which then results in two haploid cells, two haploid nuclei in this case. And then in most fungi, that happens again. And so now we have four haploid nuclei as a result of the meiosis process. Then each of those nuclei migrate out to the tips of this terminal cell. Those form a cell wall around them, and they fall off, and we start all over again. By the way, there are some fungi that only undergo a single cell division event in meiosis. By the way, with animals, there are two division events. So it goes from a cell, what they call a cell, a sex cell, to two nuclei to four nuclei. So two division events, right? So anybody know the scientific name of the store-bought white button mushroom? Agaricus bisporus, right? So that mushroom only undergoes one division event to create two spores on each of these. And then chanterelles actually undergo a third division event, and they have these beautiful terminal cells that are called basidia that have 8 spores on the ends of them. It looks like a little crown or one of those water droplet photographs, Yes, Dan.
So when you see spores from a mushroom, like on a piece of paper or like in the air, what are you actually seeing? Is it like just a cell? Is it like packaged?
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of these right here, right? So you're seeing potentially millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of those cells en masse, those spore cells. Okay, and that's after that's dropped off of this terminal cell that's located on the gills. Right. Okay. All right, all clear? You can wake up now. Okay. All right, so let's talk about then, let's change gears. Let's talk about how fungi fit into the environment. There are three main categories that we can talk about, and I'll talk about some other categories a little bit later. So they are the primary decomposers of organic material in substrates. So, and we'll talk about how primary they are. More so than any other organisms, they are involved with breaking down wood and soil and other things. A second category would be those that form mutualistic relationships with other organisms. So there are fungi that have a symbiosis that is mutualistic. They both benefit from that relationship. And then there's a lot of fungi that cause diseases. They're pathogenic, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So let's take each of those categories one at a time. So first of all, let's talk about fungi as decomposers. So it turns out that about half of all macrofungi are saprotrophic. So sapro means dead, trophic means how they eat. And if we look at a compost bin or at like a grassland, prairie grassland, about half of the microbial biomass is fungal in nature. When I say microbial, I'm referring to microscopic organisms. So just ignore the earthworms and the millipedes and sow bugs and all those sorts of things, the mites even. So we're just talking about really a couple of main categories, and that's fungi and bacteria. So in a compost pile, the other half of the microbial biomass would be bacterial in nature. Now, if we look in a forest, though, it turns out that somewhere between 60 and 90% of the microbial biomass is fungal in nature. So that's how important fungi are to decomposition, certainly, especially in a forest conditions. Now, there are various types of decomposers. There's litter decomposers. So, for example, this little marasmius here is growing on this oak leaf right there, and is decomposing that oak leaf into smaller parts. Fungi that grow on wood and break down wood are referred to as lignicolous, which literally means lignin lover. Although there's a lot of fungi that actually eat cellulose in wood as opposed to lignin. And then arguably my favorite group are the coprophilic fungi growing on dung. So this actually used to be Psilocybe coprophila, but now it's Diconica coprophila now. Yes, Bart's. Yeah. Right. So yes, the term lignicolous is used for both the white rot and which consumes lignin, and the brown rot which consumes cellulose. Actually, the white rot consumes lignin and cellulose. So yeah. Okay, let's talk about fungi as mutualists. This was, by the way, give a little plug for the Mendo. I took this photograph at Mendo 1 year. Beautiful fall king mushroom, king bolete. So it turns out that about 10% of known fungi are what are called mycorrhizal. Or I should say macrofungi, actually. I forgot to change this slide. So those that form mushrooms, about half of them are about 10% of them are mycorrhizal. Mycorrhizal if we take that word and break it down, and that's not a misprint, there are two R's in that word. Myco means fungi, rhizal means root, right? So this is a relationship between a plant and a fungus at the roots. And it turns out that over 90% of all plant species have this relationship. Over 90% of all plant species have some sort of a mycorrhizal relationship. And that could be with microfungi or macrofungi. I'll talk about those two in just a second. But just in basics, the plants provide photosynthates, we refer to them, so simple sugars that are produced by the process of photosynthesis. And then fungi convert nutrients such as nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus into usable forms that are then used by the plant. And so there's an exchange. Some mycorrhizae actually also enhance water uptake. There are two basic types, although we could go into more detail. This upper illustration refers to what's called arbuscular mycorrhizae, or sometimes vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae. And you can see that little tree-shaped structure that is actually interior to the cortical cells of the roots of a plant. But it penetrates the cell wall, but not the cell membrane. The cell membrane wraps around all those branches. So you can imagine that the surface area contact is just phenomenal, just in a single cell. And so that's where that happens. These arbuscular mycorrhizae, with one or two exceptions, don't produce fruiting bodies. So they're microfungi. And most plants have this type. So grasses, for example, redwood trees, a lot of our food crops have this type of mycorrhizae. The other types, which this is a photograph of a root tip, is called ectomycorrhizal fungi. And ectomycorrhizal fungi form a sheath of hyphae around the root tips. So what you're actually seeing is the fungus, but the structure is based on the root tip branching. I always think of it like a corn dog. The hot dog is the root, and the cornmeal around it's the mycelium that forms this sheath around the root tip. This type of mycorrhizae does not penetrate very deep into the root. It only goes into the first layer or two, and doesn't form arbuscules in the roots, in the root cells, the cortical cells of the roots. Now, I have a new hero. Oh, wait a minute. That's in my next slide. I'll get to that. Although this big old bolete was pretty awesome, I have to say. I collected this one in Yellowstone National Park. I'm not sure what they're calling it now. There was bolete. Was it a crime? Oh, it's a national park. You can take a court plus one. There's my one. Anyway, it sure was good. I was up doing some research with mushrooms, and there was a researcher party. Boy, those are wild. And the salmon researchers brought some fish, and the pronghorn researchers brought some pronghorn steaks, and I brought this puppy. Yeah, it was a big hit. So they're mycorrhizal. Almost all of the boletes, not completely all of them, but the majority of boletes are mycorrhizal. Here's a white chanterelle. That's also, the chanterelles are mycorrhizal. This is, well, let me go to this one here. Anybody recognize that one? Matsutake, Trichiloma magnivelare, also mycorrhizal. All of these good edibles. Here's one that will kill you if you eat it. This is from the east. This is Amanita bisporigina, and it's all of the amanitas are, with one or two exceptions, are also mycorrhizal. So a lot of our popular mushrooms are mycorrhizal, and that, by the way, makes it difficult to grow them in a controlled sense. The only true successes that I know of are a few species of truffles that are also mycorrhizal. But most of the mushrooms you get in the store are saprotrophic. Okay, so here's my new hero, Suzanne Simard. How many of you have heard of Suzanne Simard before? Okay, you should take note and read this book. It's called Finding the Mother Tree. And Suzanne was born into a logging family in British Columbia. And eventually, when she came of age, she worked in the logging industry, mostly doing scouting and doing assessments of clear cuts. And to make a long story short, eventually she figured out that it was not a good idea to go in and take out what they called the garbage trees out of a clear cut, particularly birch. And so they would go in there, they take out the conifers, Douglas fir or pines or spruce, and then they go in and they take everything else out down to the bare bones, and then they'd plant new trees, whatever they wanted. So she found out that through some elegant research, that leaving the birches in place actually enhanced the health of the trees. So instead of getting in the way of the new recently planted trees, the birches were actually helping them out, and eventually figured out that there was an exchange of nutrients at the mycorrhizal level between two different species. Between the birch, early on in its life, it would give nutrients to the growing conifers, and then later on, the conifers would actually return the favor and give. So there was actually a two-way pathway for these.
What fungi was it doing that?
Don't know. I'm not sure she ever quite figured that out. But later on, of course, the rhizopogons were really important for a lot of that work. So she continued with her research and found out that not only should they leave the birches, but they should also leave some of the big trees, what she calls the mother trees. And the mother trees actually can help out the young trees. They even help out trees that are being attacked by some sort of a pathogen, beetles or other a deleterious fungus. And then also she found out that some of the trees that were being attacked by pathogens were sending chemicals to trees that had not yet been attacked, that, hey, I'm being attacked, and then they ramp up their immune systems. And from several 100 yards away, that this can happen. So anyway, you should read this. She did a TED Talk that's really good. So you should check out Suzanne Simard and her work on healthy forests. Yep.
My understanding is it was kind of, it was counterintuitive because the trees compete, right?
Yes.
But then the idea is the fungus is almost farming the trees. And it's saying, yeah, I have a better chance of keeping my symbiotes alive if I make them share these resources. Even though the big tree doesn't want to help the little competitors, they're like, come on, give them some nutrients so that I'm not hedging my bets all on one.
Yeah. So that was kind of a long question for those of you who are on the Zoom land there. But basically, Bart's was asking about whether the fungus is actually helping to facilitate this. I don't think there's any evidence that that's the case. Personally, speaking as a scientist, it's all about gradients. So if the mother tree has plenty of sugars to spare, they're going to go from the source, which is the mother tree, to a sink, which would be some of her offspring perhaps, or even different species. So I think that's a more sort of dispassionate, if you will, but more of a chemical explanation rather than a communication explanation. Yeah.
There's some of the achlorophyllus plants too that are definitely getting
Yeah.
glucose from a different species.
You're jumping the gun here, Norm. I'll get to that. So the mycoheterotrophs. So we're still on mutualistic organisms. So lichens are often also considered to be a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and either an alga or a cyanobacterium, some sort of a photosynthetic organism, referred to as the photobiont. And much like with the mycorrhizae, the photobiont is providing photosynthase to the fungus. And the mycobiont in this case does not necessarily provide nutrients to the photobiont, but it allows the photobiont to live where it otherwise wouldn't live. Now, there's some people that argue that it's not a mutualism, that it's actually more of a parasitism. And if you think about it, those are actually pretty close. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the reason for that is that the photobionts that are involved, and there's not that many species that are in this category, maybe 20 or so species of alga or cyanobacterium that are involved with thousands of lichen species. But all of those could live by themselves. So for them, the relationship is what we refer to as facultative. They could take it or leave it. But they couldn't live where they do, like on a rock or a fence or the roof of a building or an old car or whatever, without the fungus. The fungus, on the other hand, cannot live without the photobiont. So that's an obligate relationship there. So that's why some people will argue that it's more of a leaning toward a parasitism. By the way, in this micrograph here, you can see the fungal filaments, the hyphae, are basically in red, and the little blue-green splotches are the photobiont. Yep. You moved. Threw me off.
I'm curious, is that I don't have a strong biology background, the lichens, is that correct pronunciation?
Yep.
How do you know that they are organisms? It seems like they're comprised of two.
Yeah, right. That's where the term complex comes in. So the question is why, how is a lichen an organism? Yeah, it's a complex organism with actually, it turns out 3 different kinds of, they found another basidiomycete that lives in these lichens. Yeah, like a single cell yeast, basidiomycete yeast. So now, well, because they are always found together, I guess you could say. But I'm going to blow your mind here because you and I are complex organisms. You actually have more bacterial cells, living bacterial cells in your body than you have human cells by a factor of 10, I think, or something like that. So, yeah. So we're complex organisms too.
Mitochondria.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And chlorophyll is that way too. Yeah. Endosymbiosis. All right. Moving on. Okay. Fungi as parasites. This, by the way, is a cluster of honey mushrooms that are growing on willow trees at Año Nuevo. Yeah, pretty crazy. So there's definitely some fungi that cause plant diseases. 2 main diseases that happened in the United States are Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight. And both of those tree species, chestnuts and elms, were prolifically growing throughout the eastern half of the United States. And they were iconic, under the spreading chestnut tree and all that. And these diseases came along and pretty much wiped them out. They are working hard. I think they've managed to find make some progress with generating chestnut trees that are resistant. But it turns out there's something like a dozen different genes that are involved with this disease. So it's been very tough, and it's taken 40 years or so for them to figure this out. By the way, we have a Dutch friend of the Mycological Society, Elsa, and she wants me to insist that this disease did not come from Holland. In fact, it was Dutch scientists that discovered it. So there you go. We have a disease that's hitting our native Monterey pines here called pine pitch canker, Fusarium. If you drive down the coast, down by Año Nuevo, and you look up to the east side of the highway there, Highway 1, you'll see acres and acres of dead Monterey pines that have been hit by this fungus. And then I mentioned honey mushrooms in the previous slide. There's several species found, a handful of species found here in California. And here's another species. This is growing at the base of a bay tree. And this is one of the few macro fungi that are actually parasitic. So they will actually grow and eventually kill trees that they are growing on. Yes, that's right. So the humongous fungus, which is well, yeah, no. So it was for a while, it was considered to be the largest living thing, and in hectares, it probably was at least. Well, it was considered that for a while. There is I'll get to that in a minute, but that's up in Oregon. And I can't remember exactly how many hectares it is, but it's a lot, and it it's a parasite, so it's actually affecting the health of the trees that it's growing around. So if you look at it from 10,000 feet up, you can actually see where it is, and apparently you can even see it from space. But there, in terms of biomass, there's an aspen that's bigger. What's it called?
Tremulosis.
What?
Tremulosis.
It's tremuloides, but it's got a name. The plant itself has a name, but it's a clonal plant that is bigger in biomass. But that's been trumped by, anybody know? A coral reef in Australia that is all clonal and is bigger than either of those, and both in biomass and size. So there you go. Little trivia question for your next cocktail party. All right. So now there are some fungi that parasitize other fungi as well as plants, and we actually have it here with us. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, and Maria. Whoop. That's okay. It's just my foot. So there we go. Lobster mushroom. This is actually a type of russula. You can see the shape of the russula there that has been parasitized by an orange ascomycete microfungus that is basically a mold that grows on this fungus. The underlying mushroom, I'm pretty sure it's Russula brevipies, is basically flavorless, non-toxic, and then this mold that grows on here, the Hypomyces lactifluoris, is actually gives it some flavor. So there you go. One of my favorites is the Puccinia, sorry. Not to be confused with the guy who writes operas. Anyway, the Puccinia grows on these little Brassicaceae plants, which, by the way, do not have mycorrhizae. It's one of the few kinds of plants that lack mycorrhizae. But anyway, it grows on these little Arabis plants, and it causes two things to happen. One is an elongation of the main stem, and the other is that it grows like, it's a mold, much like the orange mold here, but it's yellow and it grows on the leaves, and it makes the leaves look like, the upper leaves look like a flower. And you can see there's a little wasp right there that's sitting on top of there. It also causes a little sugary exudate, so the wasp doesn't leave, but it gets all these little spores from the mold all over its legs, and then it spreads it to another Arabis plant. So it mimics a flower in order to disperse its spores. So some fungi are parasites on animals, or should we maybe call them predators? So many of you have heard of cordyceps. There was that really terrible, I actually haven't seen it, but I heard it's really terrible. What's it called? The Last of Us, yes, where the cordyceps gets out of hand. So cordyceps, and actually I need to change that. It's now Ophiocordyceps. Ophiocordyceps grows on insects mostly, insect larvae, sometimes spiders, and sometimes other mushrooms. And the mycelium grows through the animal, and then it forms fruiting bodies. So these things that look like antlers sticking out of this beetle grub are actually fruiting bodies that produce spores. There's evidence also that this certainly with ants, it causes a neurological dysfunction. And the ant, you may have seen this on the Nature series by David Attenborough, that causes the ants to crawl up as high as they can in a tree or on a branch or a grass blade or whatever. They latch on with their mandibles onto as far as they can, and then the thing fruits, and the spores are then dispersed farther away than they otherwise would be because they're up in the air. So anyway, that's Ophiocordyceps. There's also a medicinal value for at least one species, that's Ophiocordyceps sinensis from the Himalayas. But this is really cool in here. So this is a nematode, this worm, and it's called a roundworm. Nematodes are very abundant there and also very diverse. There's many species. Some of them are parasitic on crops. Most of them are harmless. And you see these like loops. So there's one right there, and there's another one over here. Those are loops of little loops made of 3 hyphal cells. The nematode ends up going through one of these loops. Those cells immediately fill with water and trap the nematode and then eat it. So aren't you glad you're not a nematode? That's the Last of Us Part 2. It's going to be the nematodes. And this, by the way, I believe is a Pleurotus, oyster mushroom. Well, we have actually started using, in many cases, fungi for biocontrol, since they can be parasitic. So here's a weevil type of beetle that's a pest on crops, and there's a fungus that attacks the weevil, more of a mold-like thing rather than Ophiocordyceps. And then this is an acacia. In South Africa, it's becoming a problem. Acacia from the Mediterranean, from the Europe, mostly from Europe, and they've introduced this thing that makes these big bulbous cankers that can help to control the acacia in South Africa. Here we go. So this is what Norm was referring to. So it turns out that some plants have actually turned the tables on these fungi and have become parasitic on the fungi themselves. So it turns out that most achlorophyllous plants, so these are plants that are unable to make photosynthetates, they don't have chlorophyll, and all orchids, it turns out, are mycoheterotrophic epiparasites. And that's going to be on the oral exam. So here, for example, anybody from the eastern part of the country know what that is? Yeah, it's ghost pipe. That's right. This is ghost pipe. It doesn't occur in California. I'm going to show you some examples of members of this. There's some monotrope. In fact, this is genus Monotropa. Talk about some monotropes in a minute. So ghost pipe and its relatives actually parasitize mycelium. That is, and then it steals the photosynthates that it's a mycorrhizal mycelium, stealing the photosynthates from the mycorrhizal fungus that's getting its photosynthase from some tree or shrub. So it's a three-way process, but only goes one direction, right? To the parasite, or at least in that segment of it. Anybody know this orchid? This is a great name. This is the Dracula genus. And that little, I forgot what they call that, labellum, I think, or something like that, in orchides. Anyway, that is a mushroom mimic. Looks like a little mushroom upside down, doesn't it? So, and apparently it secretes some mushroom smells as well. Anyway, that's an orchid. And then here's another orchid. This is a rain orchid. This is snow plant, which is a monotrope, and this is pine drops, also a monotrope. So going back to orchids, if you know anything about orchids, the seeds don't have any nutrition in them, unlike all other plants, or most other plants. And so they have to actually, in order to survive, they have to parasitize a mycorrhizal fungus in order to survive. And then once most orchids, once they get to a certain size, they form green leaves, and then they can do without the fungus. So these achlorophyllous plants like snow plant and pine drops in the ghost pipe, they need the fungus their entire life. Most orchids are chlorophyllous, but there's exceptions. So here in California, we have coral roots, phantom orchids, ghost orchids. Those are all, they are achlorophyllous and mycoheterotrophic their entire lives. So anyway, it's great, great story. All right, and then there's some mysteries. So there's this category of fungi called endophytes. And if you take just about any leaf off of a plant and you look at it under a microscope, you see these fungi growing through the plant. Now, this micrograph right here, the dark blue line squiggles, that's hyphae. And it's been stained. So it's not, you don't typically see it. And then in the background, you can see these sort of large greenish rectangles. Those are the plant cells. So these fungi are living in these plant cells in virtually every leaf out there. They did a study where some poor graduate student had to cut up the leaves of a Douglas fir needle into, what was it, like 50 little squares, and then they plated them out, and they found in a single Douglas fir needle that there was like 5 or 6 species of fungus living in just a single Douglas fir needle. But the graduate student had to cut it into 50 pieces, imagine. Anyway, so now there's some evidence, and you can see that here in this other photograph, that endophytes can deter herbivores, such as cattle or browsers like deer or something like that, and pathogens like beetles, beetle grubs and things like that. So this is if you Google endophytes, you're going to see all these ads for turf and seed that's E+, endophyte positive. So if you look here, you can see this is E negative fescue. Here's E positive fescue, E positive ryegrass, E negative ryegrass. So you can see, and that's mostly beetle damage in between there. And also I've seen where weeds come up in there much more readily than they do in the E positive. But that doesn't seem to hold true for all of the endophytes. And there's a lot of mystery about it. One of the theories that seems to make a lot of sense to me is that these fungi that are in these leaves are getting a leg up on the fungi that are not in the leaves. And all leaves have a lifespan. I shouldn't say all, there's always exceptions, but most leaves have a lifespan, usually a year or less, and then they fall off on the ground. And then any fungi that are around are going to come and decompose them, right? The saprotrophs. But if you're already in this leaf, Bob's your uncle, right? All right. All right, and then the final category I want to talk about is fungi as food for animals. And the term for that's mycophagy. There's a few mycophagists in this room, I'm pretty sure. There's a nice blonde morel for you. So there are many mammals that have developed a taste for mushrooms. So deer and rodents, a lot of times will take bites out of fungi. This is a Suillus that I found with a big old, I'm pretty sure it's a rodent bite out of it. See 2 teeth marks there. And then there's all of the underground fungi actually depend upon mammals, squirrels or pigs, for example, to dig them up when they're ripe. And they have strong odor, right? So the pigs and squirrels can smell them under the ground. They dig them up, they eat them, and they go poop out the spores somewhere else. This photograph I took at number 72 in at the San Francisco Botanic Garden. And you can see that squirrel right there is eating a truffle, a false truffle of some sort. And so they've actually, the underground ones have actually evolved to be eaten by mammals. Now there's a bunch of arthropods that are also mycophagous and exclusively so. So this is a fungus gnat right here. This is a fungus beetle. It's one of my favorite names for a beetle. It's called the pleasing fungus beetle. You can see on my my notation here. And then these things are really super tiny, and they jump. They can jump something like 20 times their length, their own length. And so many of you have found these. You'd grab a mushroom, you turn it over, and it's got all these little tiny things that are hopping around in there. Those are called springtails. And so they are also mycophagous. And there's lots of other kinds of insects and so on that feed on fungi. But, oh, I almost forgot. So there's some arthropods that have, some insects that have actually figured out how to grow their own mushrooms. Cultivation, all about cultivation, right? So leafcutter ants, for example, I always assumed growing up that they ate leaves, but they don't eat leaves. They feed the leaves to fungi, and then they eat the mycelium in their nests. And then this is a bark beetle in the genus Ambrosia. So, if you know your insect body parts, there's a head, thorax, abdomen, and right between the head and the thorax are these little specialized pockets. This is a bark beetle, so it lives between the bark and the wood of trees. And once the tree dies, then it moves on. But in the meantime, it takes the fungus that it's been growing in its galleries, stuffs it takes the mycelium, stuffs it in these pockets behind their head, and then they go to another tree, and then they basically grow the mycelium again in the galleries of the bark, right? And by the way, one of these days I'll put this in here, but many of you are familiar with termites in other parts of the world, in Asia and Africa, that make these big, tall mounds. They also eat mycelium, and they grow a type of fungus called termitomyces. And these things can be a meter or more across, and they're edible. Whoa. Bring one of those home for dinner, here, cook that up. Anyway, but they're also agricultural in nature. And then, of course, there's the biggest mycophage at all, Mark Lockerbie. Some of you know Mark. But this is, again, giving a plug for Mendo. There's Mark frying up some chanterelles at Mendo in the kitchen there. And then this basket was a haul from one of the participants at the Mendocino camp. So there's a cauliflower mushroom. There's some Lexinum, manzanita boletes they're called. Here's a fall king, Boletus edulis, and then there's a cocora right in there as well. So a nice haul of good edible mushrooms. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
The plants parasitizing other plants through fungi. There was actually an article that was suggesting that some of the stumps of cut off trees are continually supported by fungi that are attached to other trees. You run across, when you go into the forest, sometimes the stump is like grown over the top.
Oh, yeah.
And those are supposed to be supported by them through the fungal network to other living trees.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, so the work that Suzanne Simard and others, I should say, by the way, that there's been a lot of work done since Suzanne worked on these. But she was really one of the first. But having, a stump continue to grow its bark makes a lot of sense if it has a source, right, of photosynthase.
Needs glucose from somewhere.
Yeah, needs its sugars from somewhere. That's right. Yep, Dan.
Slide that mentioned like 60% of microbial biomass being fungi. Why are fungi considered microbial? Like they're pretty big.
Oh, because the hyphae are microscopic and typically you don't see it. So the question was, why are fungi considered microbial? And that's it. Yeah. And remember that most fungi are don't produce macro fruiting bodies that you can see. Yeah. So the question is, how do the spores survive being eaten? Yeah, so I don't know a whole lot about that, I have to say, but my educated guess is that they are either pigmented. So it turns out that pigmented spores, like remember I showed you the photograph of the pigmented spore. Pigmented spores tend to last in the environment longer than white spores, which are unpigmented, or ornamented. And boy, this is making me dizzy seeing all these images of me. Sorry. Bleh. That's a whole bucket full of ugly. So anyway, so if they're ornaments, if they have little spines or ridges, things like that, that oftentimes corresponds to an extra layer around the seed coat.
Have you heard of mycologist?
It's chitin. Say again.
Mitosporic bands?
Mitosporic bands. No, I don't.
Bands.
Bats. I don't know what that means.
There were some of the ascomycetes that grow thin, kind of cobwebby layers on substrate, and they produce mitospores in there. As part of the reproductive cycle. Ascomycetes are weird anyway.
Yeah. So by the way, going back to surviving through gut, a lot of plants depend upon that too. So they have fleshy, sweet fruits that are eaten by frugivores and that goes through the gut. That they typically have extra thick seed coat. So a similar idea, I think. Yes.
How do white rot wood eating fungus convert lignin and cellulose into food?
Oh, with a lot of enzymes. So yeah, especially so again, I don't know a whole lot about rot. Last year at Mendo, we had a really great talk about rot, but I've forgotten half of what she said. But if you think about wood and lignin in particular, as a compound, but cellulose is kind of this way too. It's not digestible. So, so you have to have the correct suite of enzymes that are able to do that. And it takes a while, right? So you can, depending on the type of rot and the fungi and the species of tree, it takes many, many years for them to break down completely. And that's because of the toughness of that compound. But that kind of goes back to thinking about evolution, right? And niches. And so there's a niche for an organism that is capable of doing that.
They like it break down until white.
You're right. So yeah, white rot is lignin and cellulose. Brown rot's just cellulose.
Maybe that's why they're breaking down plastics now too.
Yeah, so fungi, yeah. So right, again, if you have the right enzymes, you can break down plastics, yeah. Damn.
The blight that's affecting the Monterey pines, do they know where it came from or where it originated from?
I don't know. Does anybody know the answer to that? Where Fusarium came from? Yeah. Aliens. So here's an interesting thing. So the question is about where did Fusarium, the pine pitch canker, come from? So it's certainly introduced, and it's probably came from a place where there are pines that are resistant to it, but not Monterey pine, because Monterey pine natural range is very small. It's just in the Monterey and Santa Clara and Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Mateo counties, and that's it in terms of the native habitat. But I got to tell you that Monterey pine is, if not the largest, one of the largest cash crops in the world. There are huge plantations of Monterey pine where they're for lumber in Chile, New Zealand, and Australia, and even though it's native to California. So you can imagine the efforts that they're putting into trying to find resistant strains, since it's economically viable. So it's just not fair, right, for something like the elm, for example, to be being wiped out by Dutch elm disease because it's not economically important. So,
Well, parasites really do control ranges a lot of times.
yeah.
They're very good at reducing the potential for monocrops in nature.
Yeah.
So they talk about speciation, maybe the result of parasitism.
Yeah, right. So it could be just a few mutations could result in, even in Monterey or like Santa Cruz County, in the natural range of Monterey cypress, could be just a few mutations could result in a resistant strain of Monterey pine.
It's a matter of time, probably.
A matter of time, yeah, matter of time. If they all survive. Okay, yeah.
Microtrophs that are like
I think with a coral root, Corallarizae, and I think there's isn't Phantom Orchid up on Mount Tam? I think there is.
There's that salt marsh daughter, that orange string.
Oh, that's a pure parasite. So there are a lot of plant parasites that are not mycoheterotrophic, and daughter, the orange silly string stuff, is one. Some mistletoes are they're hemiparasites. Some are pure parasites.
Isn't what is it? Maybe a paintbrush?
Yeah. So paintbrush is a paintbrush is a hemiparasite. It's a root parasite directly on the roots, but there are some relatives of that called Orobanche. Some of you know that are achlorophyllous. So they're not mycoheterotrophic. Yeah.
Yeah, those are actually pretty common in a lot of places.
Yeah.
The Santa Cruz Mountains up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mount Tam.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.